Luke Carter had been in Millbrook Crossing since sunrise and wanted nothing more than to be back on the road before noon. Towns had never suited him. He knew how to load a wagon, mend a fence, and read weather in a cloud bank, but he had never learned how to stand in a general store and make small talk with people who wanted to know his business. For years running the ranch alone had made him even less inclined to try. The street was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning, wagons lined up outside the mercantile, church bells not yet ringing but the building itself already dressed for something, white ribbon tied along the fence posts, a small crowd gathering near the steps in their good clothes. Luke had heard talk in the store about a wedding that afternoon, one of the big ranchers marrying, though he had not caught the name and had not asked for it. Weddings in other men's families were none of his business, and he preferred it that way. He had what he came for: flour, salt, coffee, a coil of new rope, and a crate of nails for the barn roof that leaked every spring without fail. He tied down the canvas, checked the wheels, and climbed onto the box. He was reaching for the reins when he heard it. A sound from behind him. Fabric shifting against wood. Someone trying very hard not to be heard and failing. He climbed down and walked around to the back of the wagon. He lifted the canvas flap. A young woman sat wedged between the flour sacks and a rolled blanket, still wearing a wedding dress gone gray with road dust, her veil torn at one edge and hanging loose over one shoulder. Her eyes found his, wide and searching, the look of someone deciding in half a second whether the man in front of her was a threat or the only chance she had left. Her hands were scraped raw at the knuckles, the lace at her hem torn where she had climbed over something to get where she was, and there was a stillness to the way she held herself, like a rabbit deciding whether the safest move was to bolt or to stay small and hope she had not been seen. She reached out and closed her hand around his wrist. "Please," she whispered. "Don't let him marry me." Luke did not move his arm away. He looked at her face, at the fear in it that was too raw to be anything but real, and felt the ground shift slightly under a morning that had, 10 seconds earlier, been the most ordinary kind of day. Before he could ask her name, a bell began ringing somewhere behind the church at the end of the street, 3 sharp strikes and then a 4th, wrong for any Sunday service and too urgent for a wedding bell either. Boots hit the boardwalk. A voice shouted for the road to be blocked. Somewhere close, a horse was brought up hard enough that its hooves skidded on packed dirt. Luke looked down at the woman's hand still gripping his wrist, then at the dust rising from the direction of the church, then back at her face, pale under the road grime, waiting for his answer like it was the only thing left that mattered to her in the world. He had 30 seconds, maybe less, to decide whether a stranger's fear was worth the trouble that was about to come looking for her. Who was she running from, and why had she chosen a man she had never met to trust with her life? Stick around to find out whether Luke's choice costs him everything, and drop a comment telling me which state or country you're reading this from tonight. Luke dropped the canvas back into place. "Stay down," he said. "Don't move until I tell you." He climbed onto the box, took up the reins, and set the horses walking, unhurried, the pace of a man with nowhere urgent to be. His pulse said otherwise. Every instinct he had built over 4 years of running a ranch alone told him the smart thing, the safe thing, was to have never lifted that canvas at all. He kept the wagon moving anyway. 3 riders came around the corner by the mercantile, moving in a slow sweep down the street, checking wagons as they went, pulling back canvas here, glancing under a bench seat there. Luke recognized the lead man's coat before he recognized his face. Every rancher within 50 miles knew who dressed his hired men that way. Silas Whitmore did not send riders anywhere without making sure people understood whose riders they were, the fine wool, the matched horses, the particular unhurried confidence of men who had never once had to answer for what they did in another man's name. The lead rider pulled up alongside the wagon. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Luke answered. "Looking for a young woman. Left the church this morning in her dress. Didn't get far on foot, we figure." The rider's eyes moved over the wagon, over the tied canvas, over Luke's face. "You seen anybody on the road coming in?" Luke thought about the woman's hand on his wrist and the fear in her voice, and he made the only decision that felt honest to him in the time he had to make it. He did not know why she was running. Until he did, the benefit of the doubt belonged to her, not to the men chasing her. "Just my wife," he said. "She's sick this morning. We're headed home." The rider's gaze lingered on the canvas a moment too long, long enough that Luke felt his own heartbeat in his ears and made himself keep his hands loose on the reins instead of tightening them. Then a voice came from behind the canvas, unsteady but clear. "Luke, is something wrong?" The flap moved aside, and the woman looked out at the riders with the pale, irritated look of someone who wanted only to go home and lie down. Her hair had come loose enough to hide most of her face, and somewhere in the last 30 seconds she had smeared road dust across one cheek that made her look convincingly unwell. She held a hand to her stomach. The rider studied her, studied Luke, and finally touched his hat. "Sorry to trouble you, ma'am." He turned his horse and rode on with the other two, back toward the church where more shouting had started up, someone calling Clara's name into the crowd like she might simply step out of a doorway and answer. Luke did not breathe easy until Millbrook Crossing had shrunk to a smudge behind them. He left the main road at the fork and took the old river trail instead, longer, rougher, and empty of anyone who might be looking for a wagon on its way out of town. It was another hour before he pulled up beside a stand of cottonwoods and helped the woman down, her legs unsteady after so long folded into the wagon bed. "Clara Bennett," she said, before he could ask, brushing dust from her sleeves with hands that were only now beginning to shake now that the danger had passed. "And I owe you an explanation, Mr. Carter. Whenever you're ready to hear it." "Didn't say I needed one yet," Luke said, though the truth was he wanted it badly, wanted to understand what kind of trouble he had just agreed to carry without ever having said yes out loud. Somewhere behind them, in a town that would not stop looking, a man with money enough to buy silence was already deciding how far he was willing to go to get her back. They made camp that evening in a hollow off the river trail, far enough from the road that a fire would not be seen from it, close enough to water that the horses could drink their fill before morning. Clara sat wrapped in one of Luke's blankets, her wedding dress traded for a plain shirt and trousers he kept for mending fences, watching the fire catch and hold before she finally spoke. She told him what she had not been able to say in town, in pieces at first, and then, once the first pieces were out, in a steady unbroken telling that seemed to cost her something with every sentence. Her mother had died the winter before, leaving debts Clara had not known existed until the papers arrived, written in language dense enough that neither she nor her aunt had fully understood what they were signing until it was already done. Silas Whitmore held every one of those debts. He was the largest cattle owner in 3 counties, a man who smiled at church socials, donated generously to the building fund, and called in favors like a man collecting rent, patient and pleasant right up until the moment patience stopped serving him. He had offered to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for a wedding, framed as a kindness, a rescue, and Clara's aunt, frightened and outmatched by a man with more lawyers than the whole county had judges, had signed the agreement before Clara ever laid eyes on it. "By the time I read it myself, the wedding was already announced," Clara said. "My aunt thought she was saving us both. I don't think she understood what she'd traded away. It was never about wanting a wife," Clara said. "My father left me land near the ridge line. There's a spring on it that never runs dry, even in drought years. Every rancher for 20 miles depends on that water sooner or later. Silas doesn't want a bride. He wants the deed, and marrying me was the cleanest way to get it without anyone calling it theft." Luke listened without interrupting, the way he listened to weather coming in, patient and watchful, letting the whole shape of the story arrive before he responded to any part of it. He had seen men like Whitmore before, men who used paperwork the way other men used a gun, and had learned over the years that the ones who smiled the widest at church socials were usually the ones worth trusting the least once the doors were closed. "Debt doesn't give a man the right to your life," he said finally. "Paper or no paper." Clara looked at him for a long moment across the fire, as if she had expected him to argue, or to ask what was in it for him, or to say something about the risk he had already taken on her behalf, and had not expected a simple answer instead. "Most people around here would tell you it does," she said. "Enough people have signed papers they didn't understand to keep men like Silas comfortable. My father used to say a signature is only as honest as the man asking for it, and he wasn't wrong. I just didn't understand what he meant until it was too late to matter." She explained, as the fire burned lower, exactly what her father had left her, a modest parcel of land near the ridge line, unremarkable on paper except for a single spring that ran clear and steady even in the driest years, a spring that half the small ranches in the valley had come to depend on whenever their own wells failed. It was the kind of land that looked worthless to a stranger and priceless to anyone who understood water in dry country. Silas had understood it immediately. It was the kind of arrangement that had ruined families up and down the territory for years, families with land and no lawyer, families who trusted a signature more than they should have, who discovered too late that a debt could be a leash as easily as it could be a loan. Luke had watched it happen to a neighbor once, a widow forced off good grazing land by a debt that had somehow doubled between the signing and the calling in, and had been too young and too powerless at the time to do anything but watch. He was neither of those things anymore. He banked the fire and told her to sleep. Whatever came next, they would be moving again before first light, and Whitmore's men would not stop looking simply because one road had come up empty. The weather turned on the second day, a wall of cloud rolling in from the west that Luke read as trouble long before the first drops fell, the kind of storm that swallowed a whole sky in the space of an hour. By the time the rain came in earnest, sideways, and cold enough to sting, he had already turned the wagon toward an old line cabin he knew from years of running cattle through the hills, half a day's ride from anywhere Whitmore's riders would think to search and forgotten by nearly everyone but him. They reached it soaked through and shivering, the horses stamping gratefully once they were under cover. Luke got a fire going while Clara wrung out her sleeves by the window, watching the storm turn the yard outside into a sheet of gray water that hid the tree line entirely. "You could have left me on the road," she said, not quite a question, watching him work at the fire rather than looking at him directly. "Could have," Luke agreed. He did not offer more than that, and for a moment the only sound in the cabin was rain on the roof and the fire finding its feet. "Why didn't you?" He considered the question longer than she probably expected. "Man who leaves a scared woman on the side of the road because helping her is inconvenient isn't much of a man," he said finally. "My brother used to say that. Figured it was worth listening to, even after he wasn't around to say it anymore." He gave her his coat when hers would not dry, draping it over her shoulders without making a show of the gesture, and for the first time since the church bells had rung behind them, they talked about something other than Whitmore. She asked about the ranch, about the brother he mentioned only in passing, about why a man who could clearly hold a conversation chose to spend most of his days without one. He told her, briefly, about Benjamin, about the accident with a spooked horse that had left the ranch to a younger brother who had never planned on running it alone. He asked, in turn, how a schoolteacher's daughter had learned to read weather well enough to know a storm was coming before he'd said a word about it, and she laughed for the first time since he'd lifted the canvas, a Rayal laugh, surprised out of her. "My mother taught school in a building with a tin roof," she said. "You learn to hear rain coming from a mile off, or you spend your whole childhood soaked." Clara attempted to cook over the cabin's small fireplace and nearly burned the both of them out of the building doing it, waving smoke away from a pan of beans gone black at the edges while Luke stood in the doorway trying not to laugh and failing entirely. "It's edible," she insisted, handing him a plate with the particular defiance of someone who knew it was not. "It's charcoal," he said, and ate it anyway, and did not complain when it stuck to his teeth, because the sight of her standing there with soot on her cheek and her chin lifted in stubborn pride was worth more than a decent supper. They talked late into the evening after that, about small things mostly, the names of horses, the best way to keep a fire through a long night, the particular stubbornness of a mule Clara's family had once owned that would not cross water no matter how it was coaxed. It was easy in a way neither of them had expected, two strangers thrown together by fear finding, somewhere past midnight, that the fear had loosened its grip enough to let something else in. By the time the storm passed and the cabin had gone quiet except for the fire, something had shifted between them that neither one named out loud. Clara fell asleep near the hearth wrapped in Luke's coat, and Luke sat up a while longer, feeding the fire in small handfuls, watching the light move across her face, thinking that he had not expected a stranger under his wagon canvas to feel less like trouble and more like company he had been missing without knowing it. They reached the ranch 3 days later, tired and travel-worn, just as the first hard snow of the season closed the mountain pass behind them, white coming down thick enough by evening to bury the wagon ruts they had left in the yard that same afternoon. Clara stood in the yard and looked at the house, the barn, the fence line disappearing into white, and said nothing for a long moment, the way a person looks at a place they suspect will matter to them more than they are ready for yet. "You'll be here until spring," Luke told her. "Pass won't open before then. No way through, no way anyone gets to you either." She nodded, and if the idea troubled her, she did not let it show, though Luke noticed the way her shoulders eased slightly at the second half of what he'd said more than the first. What surprised him was how quickly she made herself useful. She refused to sit idle through a winter she had not planned for, and within a week the house looked less like a place a bachelor had been camping in for 4 years and more like somewhere a family might live. She mended clothes that had gone unmended since his brother's death, folded away in a trunk Luke hadn't opened in longer than he wanted to admit. She cooked meals that improved steadily from the disaster in the line cabin until Luke found himself looking forward to supper in a way he hadn't in years, and spent hours in the barn learning the horses by name until they came to her hand without hesitation, even the gray mare that had never once let Luke approach her without a fight. She had opinions about the ranch, too, more than Luke expected from a schoolteacher's daughter who had never run cattle a day in her life. Ideas about a second well closer to the low pasture so the herd wouldn't have to be walked so far in dry months, about rotating the grazing differently to spare the ground that flooded easiest come spring. Luke found himself listening to more of them than he expected to, and agreeing with more of them than he wanted to say out loud just yet. The house had been quiet since his brother died, quiet in a way Luke had stopped noticing because he had grown used to it the way a man grows used to a sound that never stops. He noticed its absence now, the small sounds of another person moving through the rooms, humming while she worked, arguing cheerfully with a stubborn hinge on the pantry door. There was a difference between a house with no one in it and a house where someone was simply in the next room, and he had forgotten how wide that difference could be until it was gone and then, suddenly, returned to him. Caleb Turner rode over from the neighboring spread not long after the snow set in, official reason being a borrowed plow blade he could easily have waited until spring to return, real reason being plain curiosity about the woman Luke had brought home and had said almost nothing about to anyone. His wife Emma came the following week with a jar of preserves and no pretense at all about why she had really come, settling in at the kitchen table with Clara like they had known each other for years rather than minutes. "She's kind," Emma said to Luke privately, out on the porch while Clara and Caleb argued cheerfully inside about whether a particular horse could be trusted near children. "And she looks at you like she's already decided something you haven't caught up to yet." Luke didn't answer that. But he thought about it longer than he would have admitted, long enough that Emma laughed at him for it before she'd even finished her coffee. Winter on the ranch moved slow and quiet, and it was in that slowness that things between them changed without either one announcing it. There were no declarations, no single moment either could point to later and call the beginning. There was coffee poured for two instead of one before Luke had even noticed himself doing it. There were chores done side by side that used to take one person twice as long and now seemed to take no time at all, mostly because neither of them was in any hurry to finish. There was a snowball, thrown without warning across the yard one clear morning, that started a fight neither of them won and both of them remembered for weeks afterward, laughing about it over supper until Clara nearly knocked over the coffee pot recreating the moment Luke had gone down face first into a drift. Clara left him a note once, folded and tucked under a coffee cup, nothing more than a thank you for a day he had barely thought worth mentioning, splitting wood so she wouldn't have to. He kept it. He told himself it was an accident that he hadn't thrown it away, and he told himself that every time he found himself rereading it weeks later, in the barn, where he was fairly certain no one could see him doing it. Evening settled into an easy pattern neither had planned. Luke would read by the fire, Clara would sew or write in a small journal she kept close and never showed him, and some nights neither of them said much of anything at all, content simply to share the room and the quiet. Other nights they talked until the fire burned low, about things that had nothing to do with Whitmore or the ranch or the winter closing them in, about small hopes neither had voiced out loud to anyone else. There was a night, late in January, when Luke reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them let go for a long while after. She started leaving little marks of herself around the house that had not been there before. Curtains mended and rehung. A shelf of books she had asked Caleb to bring from town. A garden already sketched out on paper for a spring that had not yet arrived, rows and rows of vegetables planned out in a careful hand, as though she had already decided she would be there to plant them. The house had stopped being a place Luke simply lived in and had started becoming a place they were building together, one small ordinary act at a time, until neither of them could say exactly when it had happened. Neither of them spoke of what would happen when the pass opened, of Whitmore, of the debt still hanging unresolved somewhere beyond the mountains. For a while, in the quiet of that winter, it was easy to let the world outside the ranch stay outside it, to let the snow do the work of keeping trouble at bay a little longer. It would not stay there forever, and some part of both of them knew it, even on the nights they chose not to think about it at all. Luke woke one night to the sound of Clara crying out in her sleep, a short, sharp sound that had him at her door before he had fully decided to move. She woke on her own before he reached her, breathing hard, one hand pressed flat against her chest, staring at the dark like it might still hold whatever had frightened her. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice said otherwise, thin and unsteady in a way he had not heard from her since the first night on the river trail. He sat with her until the shaking stopped, saying nothing, letting his presence be the only thing he offered until she was ready to offer something back. It was not the first time he had heard her cry out in the night, though it was the first time he had let himself walk down the hall instead of lying awake pretending he hadn't heard. This time, when he asked what she dreamed about, she told him. "Silas never wanted a wife," she said quietly. "A wife is inconvenient. She has opinions, she has family, she can say no in front of witnesses. What he wanted was a name on a deed that couldn't be questioned in court, and marriage was the fastest way to get it without anyone calling it what it was." She told him then about Martha Ellis, her mother's oldest friend, a widow who had known the family longer than Clara had been alive and had watched the debt scheme unfold with a growing dread she had not been able to voice to anyone who might listen. Martha had helped her slip out of the house the morning of the wedding, through the kitchen and over the back fence in the dark before dawn, and had pressed a sealed envelope into her hands at the door with a warning to run and not look back until she was safe. "She said not to open it unless I had no other choice left," Clara said, turning the small case in her hands where the envelope had stayed hidden all winter, untouched. "I don't know what's inside. I've been afraid to look, afraid that whatever it is won't be enough, and then I'll have nothing left to hope for at all." Luke understood that kind of fear better than he let on, the particular dread of opening a door that might only confirm the worst had already happened. He did not push her to open it that night. Instead he sat with her a while longer, until her breathing had steadied and sleep had found her again, and only then did he pick up the envelope from where she'd set it on the table. He turned it over in his hands, its edges soft from being carried so far, tucked against her body through every mile of the run from Millbrook Crossing, and wondered what kind of truth a woman would rather not know than risk being wrong about. He did not open it. It was not his to open. But he understood, holding it, that whatever it held was likely the one thing standing between Clara and a future she could choose for herself, and the one thing Silas Whitmore would burn half the territory to keep buried before he let it see daylight. The pass opened earlier than expected that year, the thaw coming fast and hard after a mild March, and with it came news Luke had been dreading since the first warm afternoon. A trader passing through mentioned, without knowing what he was carrying, that a rancher named Whitmore had been asking after a wagon and a woman all winter and had recently learned exactly where both had gone to ground. It took less than a week after that for his riders to appear on the ridge above Carter Ranch, a dozen strong, dust rising behind them long before Luke could make out faces, with Silas himself riding at the front on a horse worth more than most men's houses in the territory combined. Luke had known this morning would come eventually. Knowing it did not make the sight of a dozen armed riders on his ridge line any easier to stomach. Sheriff Owen Brooks arrived not long after, having ridden hard from town once word reached him. His horse lathered from the pace, but he came with empty hands where it mattered most. The marriage contract Clara's aunt had signed was, on paper, legal, filed and witnessed and sitting in a courthouse drawer with nothing visibly wrong about it. Without proof it had been obtained through threat and forged debt, the sheriff had no lawful ground to send Whitmore's men away, and both he and Luke knew it. "I can slow this down," Brooks told Luke quietly, standing in the yard while Whitmore waited at the fence line with the patience of a man who had never once in his life failed to get what he wanted. "I can't stop it. Not without something more than what we've got." Caleb rode over within the hour, rifle across his saddle, along with two other neighbors who had heard what was happening and came without being asked, men who had watched Clara mend fences and learn their children's names all winter and had decided, without much discussion among themselves, which side of this particular fight they were on. It was not enough to match Whitmore's numbers, and everyone standing in that yard knew it. What it meant was that Luke was not standing alone, and that counted for something even against odds that did not favor him. Luke found Clara in the house, standing at the window, watching the men gathered at her fence line like something out of a fear she had been running from for months and had finally caught up to her despite every mile they had put between themselves and Millbrook Crossing. Her hands were steady, he noticed, steadier than his own felt. "There's still the envelope," he said. Clara's hand went to the small case where she had kept it hidden all winter, unopened, since the morning Martha Ellis had pressed it into her hands and told her to wait until she had nothing left to lose. She looked at Luke, then out the window at Silas Whitmore sitting his horse like a man already certain of the outcome, and understood that the moment Martha had warned her about had finally arrived. Clara broke the seal with hands that did not shake nearly as much as she expected them to. Inside was a signed confession in Martha Ellis's careful hand, along with copies of financial records Clara's mother had kept hidden before her death, records showing the debt Silas claimed had been altered after signing, inflated well beyond what had actually been owed, and witnessed by two men on Whitmore's payroll who had been paid separately to say nothing. Sheriff Brooks read through the pages twice at the kitchen table, his expression sharpening with every line. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough." He walked out to the fence line alone first, papers in hand, and the conversation that followed was too quiet for anyone in the yard to hear clearly, but its effect was not. One by one, the riders who had come with Whitmore began to shift in their saddles, exchanging glances, men who had signed on for wages and had not signed on to be named in a forgery scheme with a rope waiting at the end of it. Two of them turned their horses and rode off before the sheriff had finished speaking. Silas Whitmore's composure held a moment longer than his men's loyalty did, but only a moment. His voice, when he finally spoke, had lost the easy confidence it carried in town. "That letter proves nothing," he said. "It proves everything a judge needs," Sheriff Brooks answered. "And every man who rode out here with you just watched me say so." By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, the dozen riders who had arrived that morning had thinned to 3, and the empire Silas Whitmore had built on debt, intimidation, and other people's fear had begun, quietly and finally, to come apart. Silas turned his horse toward the porch where Luke stood, his voice pitched low enough that only the two of them and the sheriff beside him could hear it. "She belongs to me on paper," he said. "That paper is real, whatever that letter says about how I got it." Luke stepped down off the porch and stood level with him. "She climbed beneath my wagon asking for freedom," he said. "She'll never have to run again. Not from you, not from anyone." He did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for a weapon, though Caleb stood close enough to reach one if it came to that. It did not come to that. Silas looked past Luke to Clara standing in the doorway, steady in a way she had not been the morning she'd hidden beneath the canvas, and understood that whatever hold he had believed he still had over her had run out somewhere on the road between his church and this yard. Sheriff Brooks stepped forward and read the charge aloud, forgery and extortion, plain enough that even the two riders still sitting their horses at the fence line did not argue. Silas did not resist when the sheriff took the reins from his hand. Whatever fight had carried him through years of buying silence in 3 counties had nothing left to spend against evidence a judge could read for himself. It was not violence that ended it, in the end. It was the truth, carried in an envelope a frightened woman had been afraid to open, arriving exactly when it was needed most. Months later, Millbrook Crossing's small white church filled with more people than it had seen at any wedding in years, drawn as much by curiosity as by goodwill, wanting to see for themselves the ending to a story half the territory had spent the winter talking about. Clara walked down the same aisle she had once fled in terror, in a dress she had chosen herself, smiling in a way she had never once managed on the morning of her first wedding. Luke waited for her at the front, in a coat Emma had insisted on pressing that morning, looking as uncomfortable in it as any rancher forced into his good clothes, and looking at Clara like a man who had stopped being surprised by his own good fortune only because he had decided to simply be grateful for it instead. Martha Ellis sat in the front pew and cried through the entire ceremony without apology. Caleb and Emma stood up beside them, Caleb doing a poor job of hiding how pleased he was with himself for having ridden over that first winter day under the excuse of a borrowed plow blade. Sheriff Brooks stood near the back, arms crossed, looking like a man satisfied with how a difficult year had finally turned out. It was the same church where Clara had once been given away by paperwork and fear. This time, she walked toward a life she had chosen with her own eyes open, and the whole town watched the difference between the 2 weddings without needing it explained to them. Carter Ranch grew steadily in the years that followed, the herd larger, the barn roof finally patched for good, children's laughter carrying across the yard on summer afternoons in a way the house had not heard in a generation. The spring on the land Clara's father had left her ran as steady as ever, and in dry years it kept water flowing to more than one struggling neighbor who had once had reason to fear men like Silas Whitmore. Luke still kept the old wagon in the barn, unused for hauling supplies in years but never sold, never replaced. Sometimes, walking past it on his way to the horses, he would stop and rest a hand on the weathered wood and think about a morning in Millbrook Crossing when he had lifted a canvas flap expecting nothing more than an empty wagon bed. The wagon had carried flour and salt and coffee that morning. It had also carried home the woman who became his forever. That's Luke and Clara's story. If it stayed with you, follow along for the next one, and tell me in the comments where in the world this found you.